Hey, it's Tim, and I know a lot of you out there want to help support the show besides buying through the links and stuff on our show notes and our website and stuff, and we appreciate that. One thing you can do is to help our advertising partners at Libsyn better understand who our audience is. And if you could just go to this little website and fill out a couple of quick questions about your background and your age and gender and all that kind of stuff, they'll have a better sense of what kind of advertisers might be most appropriate for this here little show. We appreciate that. And the site is survey.libsyn, that's L-I-B as in boy, S-Y-N as in Nancy.com/good seats still available. Again, that's survey.libsyn, Libsyn.com/good seats still available. It's a cinch to do. It'll take you all of 5 seconds, and we appreciate it. And now, here's our show.
The NBA will celebrate the league's 75th anniversary this year, but don't blow out the candles on that cake just yet. There's a problem. The anniversary is bogus. The league has its own birthday wrong, and here's why. The NBA was the result of a merger between two rival basketball leagues back in 1949. One league, the NBL, or National.Basketball League, was formed in 1937. The other league, the BAA, or Basketball Association of America, was founded in 1946. But the NBA, as we know it now, did not exist until that merger, which took place in August of 1949. Bill Himmelman, the NBA's first and only historian, says the NBA's 75th anniversary is, quote, as bogus as the 50th anniversary was. Seems like not a big deal, but there's a Syracuse connection here that's being swept under the anniversary confetti. Elmira native Leo Ferris, who was the general manager of the Syracuse Gnats, was the guy who forced the BAA to the negotiating table for the merger in the first place. He's also the guy we credit for the 24-second shot clock, and he also oversaw the signing of black players in the NBL at a time when the BAA maintained the color line. The NBA almost certainly would not have happened the way it did without Leo Ferris. The BAA would have loved to have just run the NBL out of business, but they couldn't. Leo Ferris and the rest of the owners in the NBL were outsmarting the BAA at every turn. The BAA couldn't sign Dolph Schayes coming out of New York University. Leo Ferris finagled the signing of getting Dolph Schayes to sign with the Syracuse Nationals. The smaller league, outbid the big city BAA for a guy like Dolph Schayes. Folks, it's time to recognize the 1949 merger as the true birthday of the NBA. Maybe the NBA can put those 75th anniversary t-shirts on hold until 2024. And let's put Leo Ferris into the Basketball Hall of Fame while we're at it.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Well, hello there, everybody. How you doing? It's Tim Hanlon. It is Good Seats Still Available. It's the curious little podcast that's devoted to the various trials and travails of what used to be in professional sports. Thank you for finding us. Hoops on the brain for now. Hope you're enjoying the NCAA March Madness tournament extravaganza. Maybe the NIT is tickling your fancy. Maybe you're getting super excited for the College Basketball Invitational, the CBI, that third or fourth tier tournament. Maybe you're even excited like I am as a Georgetown graduate of the new thing called the Crown tournament that Fox is putting on, featuring many different also rans and a whole bunch of teams that didn't even crack the 500 level this year in terms of wins and losses. Who knows? Who cares? It's just more college basketball, and I guess we're just all addicted to it this time of year. So anyway, in that spirit, in that vein, why don't we focus on basketball? And as you know, back in the day, before or as the professional basketball thing got off the ground, right? The collegiate game, not unlike in football, was primary in terms of skill and attraction and drawing crowds and that kind of stuff. And the earliest days of the NBA were certainly part of that mixture. And our guest this week, Josh Elias, is going to help us sort of wend our way through some of the crucial moments of that. And we're going to try to laser focus on the actual year of the merger. That's the 1949-1950 season. Call it a year, call it a season, whatever. But that's the first season when the two tributaries of what is now known as the National.Basketball Association, this thing called the National.Basketball League and the Basketball Association of America, conjoined. I think the official date announced was August 3rd, 1949, to craft what is now a legacy league that continues to amaze, confound, and as we record this now, at this moment, it contains the most valuable franchise in all of professional sports, at least in the United States, and that is now the Boston Celtics, which just sold for a record quadrillion dollars. Lots of reason for that, but a far cry from 1949, 1950 for sure. And it's really cool to go back and to understand what the hell this BAA was all about, what the hell this NBL was all about, why and how the NBA sort of came into being, and the various reasons for all of this stuff to congeal. And I'm not saying, I wouldn't say that congeal was actually the best word, right? Because there was lots of things that sort of happened and had yet to happen in the years ahead to sort of stabilize this thing known as the NBA. The clip that sets it up, though, I thought was fascinating. And again, YouTube is just is a wonder in terms of helping us discover some vocalizations, I guess, of setting up our various conversations. That came from, as you can tell, a little bit dated, from 2021. That was the year of the quote-unquote 75th anniversary of the NBA, right? And as you heard there in the voice of columnist Mike Waters from Syracuse.com, by the way, which I think emanates from a newspaper, the Advance Group newspaper that was or is there in Syracuse. And forgive me for not knowing that newspaper's name, but Syracuse.com is a place for which Mike Waters and his video producer Katrina Tulloch, or Tulloch, sorry, I'm not mispronouncing that, that little clip came from. And ostensibly, you hear it in Mike's setup there, right? The questioning really of the 75th anniversary or the dating of that, and perhaps how bogus that might be. And we're going to get into why, because the NBA, like a lot of situations we've talked about here on the show, conveniently adjuncts the history it wants to, and equally conveniently kind of just forgets the stuff it doesn't want to. And in the case of the NBL versus the BAA, that's front and center, not only for the beginnings or the locus of the beginnings of this league, but also the rationale as to why certain things are more favored, shall we say, in the pantheon of its written history, at least as far as it can control, and which are not. And that's the source and the focus of the conversation this week with Josh. His book, which came out about 6 months ago. We're only just getting into it now. So again, that's on me. We can only keep up with so much that's going on out there. So we're doing our best. The book is called The Birth of the Modern NBA, Pro Basketball in the Year of the Merger, which of course is 1949, 1950. It's published by our friends at McFarland. And of course, it's available wherever you get good books. And to save a couple of shekels and get it as fast as humanly possible in paperback or Kindle version, why not go to our website? It's goodseatsstillavailable.com. All you got to do is search up this episode numbered, what the heck is it now? 387? There you go. 387 of these. And you'll find a convenient link or two to our friends at Amazon, and we'll get a couple of referral shekels of love when you do so. And you will love this book. It's very accessible, but it is just chock full of historical facts and figures and stuff about this process. And it's very well researched, notes and stuff in the back, and a very thick bibliography. It's not dense, but it's very, very compelling in terms of like what was going on in the lead up, both in these individual leagues as well as the coming together of this new thing called the National.Basketball Association. So buckle up. Lots of great stuff in here for you basketball nerds. And let's get on to the conversation right now, shall we? Let's tee it up. And as always, please enjoy. How about for our audience? If you maybe just give us a little bit of background about your sensibilities, the proverbial day job, and frankly, your interest and or adjunct into what we're going to talk about this time here, this sort of first year of the NBA and its a place in time, so to speak, in basketball history.
Yeah, absolutely. So I came into this particular project off of the back of having run a pretty small, modest sports media company for a while. Accidentally, really. I got into that I got into sports writing during early college years, and then got a bunch of promotions until all of a sudden I was running the company. And it was the helicopter crash that killed Kobe Bryant, and I think it was 6 other people. I was one of the first people to report on that, to the extent where I broke some news regarding it. And when I found out a few days after that the family learned from the news, from the TMZ article, that was something that really made me feel very odd about reporting on current events in association with sports. And so I got into the writing that I did, which of course was more limited than it had been before I was in the higher up position that I was in at this point. But I made sure to make it a lot more historical based and a lot more kind of whimsical as well. And it was something that I really enjoyed doing, that side of things. And when a merger happened between that company and another one, I decided to take a step back, do some freelancing stuff regarding a lot of archiving of data that's only really available in newspapers, regarding all sorts of the history stuff that is very hard to access on the internet, trying to start to make that more of something that people can access, because there's both kind of a problem of a real accessibility problem and a perceived accessibility problem involved in this.
Is that include, or would that include, or could that include things like media guides and stuff that was like printed material? Like I know there was a guy, I assume it's a guy, a number of years ago. He's since stopped doing it. I for the life of me cannot find links to this stuff, but he was on a mission. I want to say it was for hockey, but it might be for other sports too, where he was digitizing in sort of a magazine-like format. You could flip through the pages, so to speak, but in a digital format of literally media guides from years ago. And I thought that was, and still is, a brilliant idea. And frankly, maybe a little bit of kind of what you're talking about. Some of this stuff is just locked up in physical pages that could be benefited by more electronic access.
Yeah, that's not something that I've done too much work with. I've used certainly. Certain colleges are very good at retaining their old media guides and at retaining old information in their current media guides. And so I use them as a resource for college information a decent portion of the time. But what I do for those sorts of purposes is mostly in old newspapers. During the process of writing this book, I went through probably around 12,000 old archived newspapers in order to get a solid enough basis, not just for the sources, but for the sources that are just in my brain for contextualization purposes. And so this, but getting into actually the start of why I wanted to write this book, it was in part simply because no one had done it before. There are some great historians in basketball, but there's not the culture of historianism of basketball like there is in baseball, for example.
Okay, very good question. Why is that? I literally had this conversation a couple of days ago for another episode, still yet to be put out there. We were talking about the same for hockey, which is actually arguably even less so. Yeah,
I would agree with that. Yeah.
Yet hockey actually has arguably has a pro history that even started earlier, really, than basketball did in the United States. So the dearth of that, by comparison to baseball, which you could make the argument is maybe over-indexed in terms of how much history and writing has been done. I don't know. Maybe some people say it could never be enough, but I'm curious about that point because I think it's very real.
Well, I would like to push back a little bit on the argument of hockey having a larger scale pro history than basketball does, because basketball's pro history goes back a lot farther than I think probably more than like a single digit number of people are aware of. the first professional basketball team came into existence in 1896. There was 2 full-fledged leagues by 2 years after that. And so there's half a century of professional basketball history that comes before the words National Basketball Association were ever uttered. But I think that baseball being so much better at that than the other professional sports is really more of an issue of centralization and popularity than anything. In all entertainment industries, which includes all sports, so much of the economics comes down to circulating nostalgia. And that nostalgia was there for baseball very early because there was major leagues, clearly major nationalized leagues at an earlier level. And therefore, it was easier to be a fan than when basketball had great leagues, but those leagues were vaguely like you had to be in Pennsylvania or New Jersey or New York or Massachusetts to be able to really witness the top athletes within that sport. And so baseball had that sort of aspect to it where it was easier to access as a fan. And there were so many, it was very early on that you could catch games on the radio, all that sort of stuff. Basketball, there was a lot of leagues that came and went. There was a whole lot more teams that came and went. It was very easy for you to not be able to really be invested in a professional team just because you would have a professional team in your city for maybe 3 years and then it would no longer exist. And there's, I think, almost an intentionality within the NBA, even once it became centralized. And part of that is these days, there's so little of that nostalgic element to the early 1950s of basketball. The 1949-50 season, there was 2 players from that season who are still alive. And so there's just, it's not the same as if you look to once Russell and Chamberlain came along. And then again, once Magic and Bird came along, and again, once Jordan came along, that there just became a significantly larger number of fans in a very short period of time, just an injection after an injection after an injection of fans. And so when you have smaller markets, fewer teams, not a lot of following, harder to follow the sport, it's something that there just isn't really room for that in some ways. And then once it became popular enough to pick things up like that, you come into a sport now where you're working as a historian in the 80s in the Stern era or something, because that's really when it became, I feel like, popular enough for historians to be something that's wanted and needed within basketball. You have so much time that you aren't familiar with at all. And of course, it would be decades after that before things were really properly digitized to be able to find some random newspaper about a team from the 1920s relatively easily, like you can today.
Yeah, that is interesting, and I guess this is a step towards maybe the primordial ooze, I guess, that we get into, or we'll get into in a minute, about sort of the tributaries that sort of ultimately created the NBA in 49-50. But prior to even these, the BAA and the NBL kind of existing, right? There were various attempts, to your point, and regional leagues at that. But also there was these industrial leagues as well, right? Which were sort of part of maybe a little bit of background on that, because I think a lot of that was arguably maybe the most, the most regimented, I guess, of professionalism in this earliest time. If
I would argue that for the Midwest, at least, that would be the case. It would be the most.
And by the way, not full time either. These guys were pros in the fact that they were working as well as playing, and arguably pros, but also pros, doing a day job too. Yes.
And that's the league the league system that oversaw that was called the AAU, the same name as the AAU today, but a very different entity in terms of what their overall meaning of what they do is. But yes, there were a lot of company teams in the Midwest, the South Midwest, and there were some in the East and some on the West Coast as well. It really didn't popularize in the West Coast until after World War II. But this was something that was really going on for a long time in the Midwest, where there were company teams. And these company teams would be officially amateur, but a lot of the times the top ones would give an extra pay rise to someone for their job because of them being a better basketball player. And there were certain companies that had very intentional ways of trying to use that as, I guess you could contextualize it in a modern way as to kind of similar to what Qatar and Saudi Arabia and those sorts of places are doing in soccer with what we call sports washing. This is, I mean, it's certainly a more minor thing. General Electric didn't have nearly as many things to hide in the 1930s as the Saudi government does now. But it's the same sort of idea where it's this kind of subtle propaganda through sport. And they, at that point in time, because of the economics behind all sports aside from baseball, really at that point in time, it was very easy to have those sorts of setups where you would have professional level athletes who would be professionals at your company and would choose to do that rather than try for the officially professional version of the sport. And they would then represent the team in that sport. And that's really a lot of how the NBL came to be. But that was originally founded ultimately by the Firestone Corporation, the Goodyear Corporation, and the General Electric Corporation. That's how the NBL came into existence.
That's very interesting. Was there ever, so in that process though, and I guess this, I think I hear the answer to come from you then, was the NBA, was that essentially assumed that it would, was there ever a thought about spinning that off, if you will, right, to become a separate sort of entity and maybe, you know, truly outside of the purview or the ownership, if you will, or the influence of these companies, or was that just too intertwined that could even happen?
It was something where it was a case-by-case basis, ultimately. It was very challenging for that to be the case, but there are teams that still exist today that started out that way. The Detroit Pistons, right now, began as an industrial league team around 1940, called the Fort Wayne Zollners. They represented the Zollner Corporation, named after Fred Zollner, who would be their owner throughout until, I think, the mid-'70s. And he ran a company called Zollner Machine Works, which made a lot of pistons and was really successful during World War II. They were known for, they did a lot of the engine work for the U.S. Army Air Corps, which is now the Air Force. And ultimately, that led to some interesting situations within their time in the NBL that actually led them to be able to thrive in a special way because of them being so connected to the military during World War II. That players could basically use the Pistons as a way to draft dodge. If they didn't want to serve in the military, just go to the Pistons and officially sign as a member of the company rather than as the team. And you would qualify for a certain ability to get away from serving in the war overseas. But the Pistons, once the merger happened, once they jumped over to the BAA, the BAA had an anti-corporate rule. And so they had to change their name from being the Zollners to the Pistons. They had to distance themselves from the Zollner Corporation. And the same thing happened with the merger a couple years later with the original Denver Nuggets. The same thing happened around the same time with the Indianapolis Kotskis that became the Indianapolis Jets. And so once they were within the professional league system, that was something that was pretty easy to get away from. Those that remained in the AAU and never turned professional, they, generally speaking, it was very hard for them to exist without the support of the company around them. The Nuggets were an interesting situation in that they existed, I think, 23 years or so before they joined the NBA as part of the merger. And they had gone through a bunch of different sponsors, and at one point even briefly were fully independent, but at that point still had connections with the Denver Chamber of Commerce that helped with employment sorts of situations. That it just took a lot of luck and maneuvering in order to be able to get from an industrial sponsored situation to something else that is its own individual organization.
Well, there was also this American Basketball League that was around too in the 1920s, right, for a short period of time, 6 years, yes. 6 years or so. And that was really, I guess, the first attempt to kind of create a pro league. But it sounds interesting that this NBL basically was around for a good, 12 seasons or so with sort of this, I don't know, call it hybrid model. I know there were some independent teams in the mix there too, but obviously dominated by the corporate kind of structure given the ownership. But along comes this BAA thing in 1946. Maybe a little bit of understanding as to what that was all about. Was the founding of the Basketball Association of America a response, perhaps, to what NBL was doing or not doing, or what was it because more people were paying attention to the game and they thought there was a better model? Like, why was that, given how long, if you will, lasting the NBL was and relatively successful, I guess, in terms of drawing attention and stuff? What was the thinking about the BAA coming onto the scene?
The Basketball Association of America ultimately didn't have much of a sort of impact on their founding from anything that the NBL had done. First off, East Coast professional basketball was a very long-standing tradition at this point. 1896 was when professional basketball first became a thing over there. The late 1900s, that is the decade, 1900 to 1909, was when it first became the case for players to be able to play professionally and have that be their entire salary. The ABL in the mid-1920s to 1931 with the Great Depression was the first time that there was a really kind of a nationalized league, in the sense that it spanned from, I believe, Detroit to Boston. And then after the Great Depression hit and the ABL went under, there was this second ABL, which was ran by the same people, but was a much smaller organization that did exist for quite a while. And it actually was still existing as a minor league for a few years at the start of the NBA. But it came as a part of a merger from two leagues that existed from, I want to say, 30 to 32. And it existed from 32 to 53. So the ABL was really the context that the BAA existed alongside.
Interesting.
But it didn't come about, the BAA didn't come about until it was really spurred on by World War II. At the end of World War II, there had, throughout the war, been a bunch of what they call service leagues, which were regionalized groups of teams that would compete for local championships that were attached to military bases. And there were a lot of professional and collegiate players who, when they were stateside, would play on these teams, and it would become this very popular thing. And the BAA did a very good job at attracting players from those leagues. And so that was a sort of space that they were able to easily vacuum up. It was first conceptualized as a league far earlier than that. It was the mid-1930s, I believe, where a guy named Max Case, who was a sports writer, first started to talk about what would become the BAA with a guy named Walter Brown, who was a very well-known at the time hockey coach and owner. And he would become very well-known in the NBA as the first owner and general manager of the Boston Celtics. And it took about a decade. It took until right after World War II for that idea to really pick up. And really what spurred that on to happen, to really get that momentum, this might be a bit of a cynical view of it, but it was more of a financial thing on the part of arena owners than anything. It was the guys who owned arenas, the guys who were the owners of hockey teams, and the guys who were the principal funders of the ice capades were a significant majority of the owners who came together to make the BAA a thing.
Yeah, so I didn't interrupt. So it looks like that the founding conversation around the BAA were pretty much made up of like arena and facility owners, right? Like this was like inventory for these places where either hockey was going on or certainly college basketball, which was very popular at the time. It looks like this was literally like an exhibition oriented kind of mindset.
Yes. And having a league there allowed them to fill dates that they would otherwise have to scramble to fill, and really helped them to be able to have more stability in terms of the profit margins that they had as owners of the arenas. And the hockey owners that would be able to, like the hockey owners that weren't the owners of the arenas, because there was often overlap, but those who weren't would have an extra income ability here through basketball. And then there were a couple other guys who came in as late arrivals to it. But that was really ultimately the idea on the ownership part, which is, of course, how a league gets founded, is through the owners, of why the BAA was necessary in their mind. And then they just kind of had to conquer the ABL, which they had the financial muscle to take away about half of the ABL starters and add them to BAA teams by the first year. And then they moved on to, by the start of their first season, they were already larger than the ABL was, and one of the two major leagues in existence at that time alongside the NBL.
So did the NBL in particular, I could see where the ABL might have thought, because they were a little bit more, I guess, minor league around this time. Is that fair to say?
Yes, that's fair to say. They were certainly at the brink where it was, I mean,
Yeah.
the BAA just coming into existence and getting a few players automatically collapsed the ABL from being a major league into a minor league.
But the NBL was effectively a major league.
Yes, the NBL was a major league, and it was still the larger league until the 1948-49 season, which was the last season before the merger happened. So the BAA was not the main league until the last year of the BAA and NBL's existence.
Okay, so I think that's what I'm most curious about, since obviously as an NBA fan and you want to look at the immediate sort of tributaries that sort of came to create it. I guess looking back on it, and with not nearly as much as understanding as you do, that's why you're here, Josh. Is you would think that the NBL would have had a greater head of steam, so to speak, in terms of its understanding of the game and scheduling and players and that kind of stuff, and more years under its belt, so to speak, versus this this BAA, which had arena heads as an ownership group, but really were kind of, I don't know, creating something kind of out of whole cloth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the BAA, they were the upstart league in a way at that point in time. And there were certainly players who didn't trust that it would exist for very long. And so there were players who chose the NBL for that reason specifically. But the BAA ultimately, they had the arenas, they had the markets, they had the money that made it very challenging for a league in the NBL, which had been very successful for quite a long time, but was struggling in the aftermath of the war. And they had small markets. This was a league where their best team, historically, the first third or so of its existence, was in Oshkosh, Wisconsin. During the second third of their existence was in Fort Wayne, Indiana. And those were like the two teams that were the face of what the NBL was, even at this point when they were no longer what they once had been. And they were in small markets. They weren't earning a ton of money. They had smaller arenas. I think Fort Wayne at this point was still playing, at least not that far earlier than this, was still playing out of a high school gym. And so they didn't have the sort of financial ability to withstand, once the BAA really got a strong idea of what they wanted to be. The BAA went out of their way to, they did a lot better job than I think anyone would have expected at bringing in the guys who had been serving in World War II. They put in a very strong effort to be explicit about, we are kind of the direct follow-up to college basketball. We're the more legitimate league. Basketball at a professional level before the BAA came around had this negative reputation of being a dirtier style of basketball than college basketball was. And so there was this respectability issue that the NBL had to conquer. And there was an East Coast culture sort of thing as well, where the big markets over there looked down on the Midwestern, Sheboygan, Anderson, Oshkosh, those sorts of areas, as even, I mean, the guy who owned the Anderson Packers was the richest man in basketball at that time. And he was really treated like some sort of country bumpkin in a lot of ways. And so recruitment became, once the BAA came into existence, something where it was a big challenge, and they had to go a lot farther out of their way to bring in players because of the legitimization aspect. And they had to keep up with salaries in a way that they otherwise wouldn't have had to. And so there became just a lot of financial problems, especially once the BAA started to really look ahead and take charge. And once they managed to get 4 of the NBL teams to jump over to the BAA, that was huge. And that became a big panic button time for the NBL at that point in time.
All right, we need to talk about this asterisk that I only became aware of through your book and stuff. And I honestly was not aware of the existence of this thing that emanated for a very brief period of time out of the NBL. That's this thing called the Professional Basketball League of America, where the owner of Well, I don't know what the full story. I know George Mikan was part of it, and it failed miserably very quickly. But it
Yes.
was literally an immediate challenge to, I guess, what the NBL was or wasn't doing. Maybe a little bit of background about that, because I suspect that this flicker of a new league, 16 teams, was it? I think, or which is just seems incredible. In 1947, 1948, that maybe was almost like a spark, perhaps that maybe even helps maybe kindle what came a couple of years afterwards.
Yeah. So ultimately, that story starts with one of the big failures of the NBL was that they never were able to have a successful team in Chicago. As a Midwestern league, that seems very odd. And it just comes down to circumstance, really. When there was finally a team that was kind of in place to do that, George Elias was running it. That was when the war broke out. And so that team quickly had to shut down, was replaced by another one that wasn't set up to do very well, that shut down very quickly. And then after, right around the end of the war, it might have been slightly after, was when the Chicago Gears popped up. And that was a team that was run by Maurice White, the owner of the American Gear Company.
Not to be confused with the founder of Earth, Wind, and Fire, but I digress.
Yes, not to be confused with that. But they eventually, they lucked into getting George Mikan, just based off of geographic sorts of things, because he went to DePaul and this was a Chicago team, so it made sense. The NBL kind of sort of had a draft, but it wasn't nearly as official as the BAA and what the NBA now is. And so there were situations in which players would get their rights assigned to a team in that sort of way, but it often was a regionalized thing, and players could just refuse to sign for what team drafted them and that sort of stuff. So it was often the case that your first round draft pick would just be the best player that's in vaguely your territory. And so Chicago happens to get George Mikan. And of course, Mikan retires after 7 games, I think it was, because he wasn't getting, he was asked to take a significant pay cut, and also his brother was waived. And so he was upset with the team and went through this months long fight. And it took until, I want to say, late January or early February for him to come back. But eventually he does come back. They make a trade for Bobby McDermott, who was I think he has the greatest case for being the greatest player of all time before Mikan came along. And so it's this great duo, outside inside sort of deal that turns this team that was a significantly losing record team at that point in time because of Mikan being on temporary retirement into the champions by the end of that year. But Maurice White was a very, very erratic person who everyone around the league could not stand. And so when they won the championship, the league just decided to give the championship trophy to the regular season champions instead, which was the team that they had just defeated in the finals. And White didn't know how to react to that. He somehow thought that the best answer to try to gain legitimacy was to attempt to run for president of the league at that point in time. And the NBL was a 2-tiered leadership structure. They had a president and a commissioner. The president was chosen from the ownership of one of the teams and was an advocate for owners and for teams. And then the commissioner was someone chosen from outside of the teams and was more for settling disputes and those sorts of things. And so he ran for president and lost by a landslide, and decided that his way of getting around that would be that he would just take his team out of the league and start his own league. And so he decided to create the Professional Basketball League of America, with there being absolutely no one else in the world who was interested in that being a thing that existed. And so it ended up being the case that he owned every team. All 16 teams were owned by Maurice White. And he then hired general managers to run all the teams instead. One of those, actually, for the team that popped up in Grand Rapids, was Gerald Ford, the future president of the United States, which is an interesting little tidbit.
That's a factoid.
Yeah, exactly. But the league did not last. It lasted, I want to say, 2 or 3 weeks, like 17 days, I think, into the season before the entire league had to fold. And at that point, everyone that was in that 16-team league became free agents, except those who had come over, who had been brought over from previously being on NBL teams. Their rights would revert to that NBL team, with the exception of the Chicago Gears. the champions, because the Chicago Gears didn't exist anymore. And so they held a dispersal draft in which the players who had been on the Chicago Gears were allowed to go on to NBL teams. George Mikan was the obvious number one pick, and the Minneapolis Lakers, instead of coming into the NBL as an expansion team, they had decided, just in case this league collapsed, which I think everyone thought was relatively likely to some extent.
They thought the NBL would collapse as well?
No, the NBL thought that the PBLA would collapse.
PBS, sorry, got it. Yeah.
And so the guys who owned the Lakers decided, in case the PBLA collapsed, they wanted to have the rights to the first selection of a PBLA player from the Chicago Gears so that they could draft George Mikan. And so their trick to do that, instead of joining the NBL as an expansion team, they bought the rights and got rid of everything to the team that had finished with the worst record in the previous season, the Detroit Gems, who had won like 4 games, I think. So they technically were the same franchise as the Detroit Gems, but they got rid of everything. So it was a brand new team. But it was just enough of a loophole for them to officially be able to get the first pick in the dispersal draft of PBLA players and get George Mikan. And so that was ultimately, I think, the thing that maybe made Morris Podoloff, the president of the BAA, think that there was some way to bring NBL teams over to the BAA and really take charge. Was once that happened and Mikan was on a newer team that wasn't really an NBL partisan and was in a large enough market for there to be a reasonable expectation that they would fit in well with BAA teams. And so I think that that's really when the idea began for him to raid the NBL of teams and consolidate things to an extent where he was trying to make the BAA the only major league and the NBL more of a minor league at that point in time. Okay,
so back at the BAA, what's going on around 47, 48? Because the 47 season, 47, 48 season, you had, was it 1, 2, 3, 4 teams had folded: Cleveland, Detroit, Pittsburgh, and I think Toronto.
Yes.
And then Baltimore had joined from the ABL. So there were, and clearly this was the second season of the BAA at that point. And the BAA also had a different kind of game, so to speak, right? I think the BAA was playing 48 minutes a game. The NBL was a 40-minute game.
Yes, that's correct.
There's a 5 versus 6 foul differential between the two. So there were some differences between these leagues too, but the NBL wasn't necessarily the paradigm of stability either, was it? At this
Neither
point?
Of them were at that point in time. It took until when the BAA was able to convince 4 teams from the NBL to jump over to the BAA, they finally became stable. But the NBL really was never truly stable. You could argue that they kind of were starting to become such right before World War II happened, and that they were on a path in 1945-46 where if the BAA hadn't come into existence, they probably would have been, but the NBL never really was a stable league.
All right, well, tell me, let's zero in on 1948 and then going into the 48-49 season, which was the last 2 official seasons of these 2, let's call them competitors, in the lead up to the grand scheme of things for the NBA that the following year. Maybe a little bit of understanding of sort of the drama and or the realities that were sort of going on between, because you're hinting at the BAA made some raids, so to speak, of some players and some whole cloth teams, right? And it's interesting because one of them, and maybe this is the headline, I don't want to put words in your mouth, was actually the Minneapolis Lakers, which itself had joined or had bolted into the end. Sorry, Mikan had joined the Minneapolis Lakers for the 47-48 season after the disaster of the PBLA, and sure enough, he's part now of another championship team, right? The Chicago in 47, and now Minneapolis in the NBL in 48.
Yeah.
But it's interesting because then it was Minneapolis bolting for the BAA the reason why other teams did too. Was that kind of the straw that or whatever the allure, or were there other factors involved in the NBL?
I don't remember perfectly, but I believe they were the 3rd team of the 4 to actually join.
All right, so there goes that theory. Okay,
yeah, keep going. Yeah. I want to say that it was either I want to say Fort Wayne first, and then Rochester, and then Minneapolis, and then Indianapolis, but I'm not entirely sure off the top of my head. But that was definitely a situation where they were trying to get all of them. The BAA was not in a great financial position in their early days. The first season, I believe, around half the teams lost a significant amount of money. The second season wasn't much better, despite the fact that this was only the teams that had survived the first year. And the fact that a team came in Baltimore and won the championship, despite not being a particularly great team and not having any star talent, and again, being a team from the ABL, now minor league, led by Connie Simmons, who had ended up in professional basketball mostly on accident. It was just not the look that the BAA really wanted. And also there was the fact that the league was very reliant on the owner of the New York Knicks, Ned Irish. He, during, I believe, all 3 BAA years, paid out the salaries of everyone at the league office. And so because of that, the league office then felt obligated to very much play favorites, which they were already tending to do for New York and Chicago just for market reasons. But it became the sort of thing where I think throughout the league office wasn't taken fully seriously because they were seen as New York Knicks partisans in some ways. The Knicks were able to break rules regarding signing players that no one else would have been able to get around. There was a center named Lee Norick that they were able to get from University of Detroit Mercy before his graduation, I believe in the middle of a year. There was Harry Gallatin they were able to get out of, I cannot remember the name of the school right now. It's a small school in Southern Illinois that at the time went by a different name than it does now. But they were able to get Harry Gallatin. He had graduated after 2 years. According to the official rules of the BAA, though, you weren't allowed to sign in the BAA until your graduating class graduates. And so he should not have been allowed to sign for a BAA team until 2 years after he actually did. And I don't think either of those rules would have been broken if it was the Baltimore Bullets or the Philadelphia Warriors or somewhere like that decided that they were going to do that rather than the Knicks.
Basketball Hall of Famer Harry Gallatin, both college and pro, went to Truman College in somewhere there, and don't tell me where in Illinois because I don't know.
Yeah.
But okay, so let me tell. Okay, so but let me ask you. Let me put it in this terminology. Was the NBL and the players and the teams that jumped, were they desperate to go somewhere else where they thought there was more stability, or was this more the BAA raiding the NBL, or was it kind of both of those things?
The BAA was definitely doing it in a way to raid the NBL for the sake of their own stability more than for the sake of making the NBL worse. The teams, I think, the first ones that jumped on it were probably trying to they were probably trying to just play a bit of a pragmatic game here and thought that the market thing is a big thing when it comes to this. And especially with Fort Wayne and Rochester, they weren't large markets. And so being the face of a league that is a lot of smaller cities that don't have nearly the same sort of staying power in when it comes to that sort of thing, and don't have the same sort of, if you put Sheboygan Redskins on a billboard, it doesn't mean the same thing as if you put New York Knicks on a billboard. And so for Fort Wayne and Rochester, that jump made sense because of them being historically important and great teams, especially the Pistons no longer being a great team after they fell apart in the previous year when Bobby McDermott, who I mentioned earlier, was probably the greatest player of all time at that point in time, got himself waived from the team for starting a brawl on a train after a game with his teammates. So that team fell apart, and they were in a situation where if they stayed in the NBL, their future was really up in the air. If they moved over to the BAA, they were now part of something bigger. And so for Fort Wayne and Rochester, that was just a really strong pragmatic move, I think, for the sake of making sure they would exist longer. And then Minneapolis and Indianapolis, it's like all of a sudden the two other contending teams here are leaving the league. Is this a sinking ship? And so they just kind of, I think it was a panic thing where all of a sudden we don't want to be the ones who are left out.
All right, what's this? Oldschoolshirts.com. Fantastic. You've heard me talk on and on and on about the great folks and the great wares at oldschoolshirts.com. Like the name implies, it's old school and it's shirts, and they put them together, into what they call oldschoolshirts.com. It's like the name implies, but of course we love them primarily for their sportswear. You name the league of the past, you name the team of the past, the chances are huge that they're going to have more than one shirt and different color schemes for things that you may remember from the United Football League or the Major Indoor Soccer League or various flavors of the original XFLs, plural, or the Federal League perhaps, or maybe World Team Tennis, or maybe it was the North American Soccer League, and on and on and on. But hey, it's not just sports. It's also great cultural touchstones and memories from the past. How about the officially licensed Evel Knievel connection? How about collection? Yeah, that's what he's trying to say. Various colleges. How about dead malls of the past? Ice cream parlors, maybe even radio stations that you might remember. Hey, even there's a latest edition of the now old, Aloha Stadium commemorative shirt. All that kind of stuff and more. You will find at least a handful of shirts that you will just transport you back into your past, and you will amaze and impress your friends at the same time. It's oldschoolshirts.com, and we got a promo code for you, of course. Let's save you some dough while you go there, and its promo code is Good Seats. Good Seats. That's the promo code at oldschoolshirts.com. Promo code Good Seats for 10% off all of your purchases. Hey, P.F. Wilson and your friends at oldschoolshirts.com, thank you for your sponsorship of the show. And now, back to our conversation. Looking at both of those leagues that last year where they were essentially quote-unquote competing, was either of them in a stronger position than the other? One would maybe look back and say perhaps the BAA only because of the arenas and the larger markets. Is that it, or were there other advantages, or maybe for the NBL's sake, just dumb luck that was going against them?
It was principally in 47-48 that the arenas and the markets were in the BAA's favor, and largely more money as well at this point in time. The NBL was still the better league when it came to actual on-court basketball talent until those 4 teams left. But the BAA was in a stronger position as a league if you take away the existence of the talent disparity.
That's actually very interesting. It's almost like a VHS Betamax kind of thing, where the Betamax was actually the better technology, but the VHS actually wound up becoming the winner for other reasons, perhaps more ubiquity and less. I'm straining the analogy, but all right. So tell us then, sort of in kind of Cliff Notes form, how the actual mechanics of the merger kind of occurs. Like, who reaches out to whom? Obviously, there had been a pretty decent jump from 4 teams going from the NBL to the BAA the season prior. How does this sort of truly come into fruition to create this newly known thing as the National Basketball Association?
So the BAA at this point, now they have the Minneapolis Lakers, the Rochester Royals, the Fort Wayne Pistons, had been known as the Zollners in the NBL, but now they're the Pistons, and the Indianapolis Jets, which again had been known as the Kotskis in the NBL. Once that they had those 4 teams under their belt, they basically thought that they won. And that's, I think, a fair assessment, that it was a very, very challenging position for the NBL to come out of. And the NBL, they were stunned. They didn't know until it was, they had, at the time, both leagues had their league meetings on the day of the draft, and they were planning on holding a joint draft. And then all of a sudden, 4 teams walk out of the NBL office and send people over to the BAA office in New York instead. And there's 4 fewer teams, 3 of them being the 3 strongest teams in the NBL in the league. And so the NBL doesn't really know what to do. The complicating factor is that the league president of the NBL has to resign for health reasons. And so they're bringing in new leadership as well, who are really forced into this almost impossible situation. And so The NBL has new leadership of Ike Duffy is their president. He was the owner of the Anderson Packers in Anderson, Indiana. Leo Ferris is their vice president, and he was the majority owner. Out over two co-owners there. One of them was Ben Kerner, who went on to own the team through the St. Louis years when Bob Pettit was there. So you might be more familiar with his name. And then Doxy Moore, who was at this point, he had been a coach in the high school level and in the NBL. He'd coached Sheboygan in the NBL for a couple of years. Moore was the commissioner. And so these three were the core of making sure that the NBL stayed alive. And they realized pretty quickly, after a brief period of a summer player war, which the players didn't actually seem to be aware of because no players really ultimately switched sides. It was the sort of thing where ultimately that just led to a small increase in player power because they could just negotiate by saying, if you're a BAA player, that Oshkosh wants to pay me this much, what are you willing to give me a raise to? Or on the other side, that if you're on an NBL team, that the Boston Celtics are interested in me, please give me a raise. But once that little period was settled, those three really decided to come up with a three-pronged plan that they believed would force the BAA to do a merger, rather than the NBL just kind of slowly fade into irrelevancy, like they had just seen happen to the ABL in the previous few years. The ABL was barely alive at this point. And so the NBL, Duffy and Ferris and Moore had this idea, three-pronged plan. First off, just make sure that all the teams survive. Now, that was a harder thing than what you would think. At this point in time, again, finances were going bad for the NBL, but it went really bad once the best teams were gone. And so Ike Duffy, owner of the Packers and now the president of the league, he was the owner of a meat packing company that was worth $3 million. In that amount of money, that's far more than that today, obviously. And he decided he was single-handedly going to make up for any amount of money lost by the teams throughout the league that year. And it was all but, I want to say, two teams throughout the entire NBL that Ike Duffy helped personally fund. Step two was to make sure the Syracuse Nationals were actually a good team. Syracuse was the closest thing to a large market that they had in the NBL at this point, now that the Indianapolis and Minneapolis teams had left. And so they wanted to make sure that Syracuse was an attractive team for the BAA to want to bring in a merger. So, and enough so for the BAA to be willing to concede that they would take in the NBL teams that they didn't want as well. And so Leo Ferris's entire job as the owner of the Tri-Cities Blackhawks, which is the team that's now the Atlanta Hawks, was to go work for the Syracuse Nationals, the team that's now the Philadelphia 76ers, and do the job of a GM for this entire team, while also running his own team. And during that time, he brought in Dolph Schayes, Hall of Famer. He brought in Al Servey from their rivals over at Rochester, who had just jumped over from the NBL to the BAA. Al Servey had been the he thought that he should have been the MVP. He probably should have been the MVP, and it was given to his teammate instead, Bob Davies. This is back in 47. Bob Davies got the MVP, and the reason why is that the owner of the Royals tried to get all the voters to vote for Davies over another player on the Royals. And so Servey had a really fractured relationship with Rochester and was willing to go over to Syracuse instead. And they brought in a few other players that really set this up to be a winning team. And so you got step one done of funding all the teams. You got step two done of fixing the Nats. And then what Doxy Moore was in charge of, and eventually all three of them really pushed hard on this, was to cobble together the team that would bring the most attention possible to the NBL in comparison to the BAA. And that was the Olympic team. In 1948, obviously this was many, many years before the Olympians were allowed to be professional. And so the Olympic team was composed, aside from, I want to say, 4 players, of the Phillips Oilers, which that is the Phillips Petroleum Company. And that's, as we were talking about earlier, a company team that was involved in the AAU at the time, and the University of Kentucky. And the University of Kentucky team had then gone on to win national championships in consecutive years. And this was the highest profile team in basketball.
And by the way, college was the thing, right? I mean, college was much more popular than
at this point. College was still relatively significantly more popular than professional ball. And so having the entire starting lineup of Kentucky, save for one eventually, because one of them left a year earlier than the others. And so he was already on a BAA team. And so they brought in the sixth man instead. So they had 5 guys from the University of Kentucky team that was the most famous team in the world come together onto one team, and they offered these players ownership stakes. They brought it together so that it would be co-owned by 6 people. Those 5 would each get a sixth, and then the guy that they brought in as a GM, who had been a sports writer for a newspaper in Louisville, I believe, would also get a sixth. And so they would get ownership stakes in this team. And all of a sudden, once they were able to actually, and also in order to get those stakes, they were funded as well by a donation from the or a loan, not an outright donation, but a loan from the city of Indianapolis itself. And so they managed to get this to actually come together. No one thought it would until it did. And when it did, all of a sudden the BAA is concerned that the NBL might have a plan to actually be a larger league than the BAA again, because all of a sudden there's all this attention on Alex Groza and Ralph Beard and Cliff Barker and Wawa Jones and Joe Holland, all of a sudden being on a team, not just on any team, but on a team together that is called the Olympians when they're known as being the U.S. Olympic team in the NBL together. And so at that point, that really forced the BAA to come to the table.
So the NBL actually did have some leverage, maybe partially or maybe almost largely because of this team.
Yes, that team. I mean, it was that 3-pronged plan there. The first 2 were really just to make it so that it was at all possible. But when this team came into place, that was the thing that made it so that the BAA not only came to the table for negotiations, but ultimately was willing to take on teams that they absolutely did not want in their league. Teams from Sheboygan, from Anderson, from Denver, from Waterloo were all of a sudden in the NBA because the NBL was able to pull off bringing together the Indianapolis Olympians that had been the University of Kentucky team.
And so as part of this merger conversation, then the Olympians were not only formed and brought into the league, they actually they were around for a couple of years, actually 4 years in the NBA. They actually finished first in the Western Division of this first year of the NBA. So pretty. So it seems like this NBA discussion, negotiation, and amalgam wound up being maybe the right thing for all concerned, and had a number of things going for it.
At first, I would say at first, yes, but a large portion of the NBL in the long term didn't succeed. It was that year was the only year for 6 teams that were in the NBA. It went from 17 teams down to 11 teams by the start of the next season. And so
let's talk about that year then, and sort of what sort of transpires and stuff, because I'm curious if you, from your research, did you think that the BAA folks kind of just knew that was ultimately going to happen, or it was in earnest that this 17 team league, or was it just kind of inevitable? Did most people recognize the smaller markets just weren't going to cut it from the NBL's perspective?
It was something where it was known very quickly, immediately, that it was extremely unwieldy. That's the language Podoloff would constantly use, is the word unwieldy to describe the league, from before it even had played a single game. And so there was a sense that I think everyone understood that not every team would still exist by the next year as an NBA team. But it was, I think, somewhat of a genuine merger in the sense of wanting the NBL teams to be part of the league to some extent. In retrospect, it doesn't look like that. But I think that was something that really came up as they just had the chance to take that opportunity when NBL representation within the league office went away. As part of the merger, they took so as I was saying with the NBL, there was this system of having both a president and a commissioner. And my interpretation of the start of the NBA was that it was kind of the same sort of deal, in that Podoloff was the president of the league, and he retained a lot of the responsibilities. But Ike Duffy, the guy who had been running the NBL, who was the owner of the Packers, was he was brought in as the chairman of the NBA, was the title that they gave him. And I think that the idea would be that he would be kind of the 1B to Podolov's 1A in terms of leadership of the league at that point in time, and that he would be a good representative for advocating for the NBL teams within that framework. Podolov knew, I think, right away that that wouldn't be a fully equal system because the BAA teams would already be advocated for by Podolov. Podolov would be the person who would do the sort of job that basically all of the job that the commissioner of the NBL had done in terms of settling disputes, being an intermediary, all that sort of stuff. He was the most public-facing face of the league. And there's also the fact that the rules committee that the BAA had, that the NBA now had, was run by Eddie Gottlieb, who was very much a BAA partisan. That infringed on a lot of what Duffy's job should have been at that point in time. And so the NBL representation was already quite limited from the very beginning. But then Duffy, I think it's fair to say, had a midlife crisis during the middle of that season. He decided in January to sell his company and work on fixing the railroad system of Indiana for the rest of his life. And at that point, put the Packers up for sale and stepped back from basically all of his duties within the league office. And so when he abdicated his responsibility as the main NBL advocate, all of a sudden the BAA was everyone in power at this point in time, and they could kind of get away with just about whatever they wanted.
Very interesting. And it seems to me that one of the more interesting dynamics for in sort of the history books, right, is this real period of time between, not inclusive of this first season, of course, and the cacophony of that, but the next couple of years where the NBA essentially consolidated and relocated some franchises and kind of got it into, I guess, what we can call it the Great Eight, if you will, in 54, 55, and from which it kind of, if fair to say, maybe solidified, and then from which it then later grew and it stabilized and then maybe grew from there, right? I think in 54, for example, the 24-second shot clock was introduced and stuff. So it feels to me like beyond just the craziness of, well, interesting, a number of years, right? So 1949, the merger of the 49-50 season, the craziness of 17 teams and the haves and the have-nots. And then the next couple of years, this embryonic NBA is really starting to kind of, pack and sort of consolidate and put some of the pieces in the right places and that kind of stuff. It's really interesting because I got to think that was painful, yet also necessary in order to kind of get it into a position where it could actually stay around for a longer period of time than anything that came before it.
Yeah, I think that's the case. I think a large part of what happened in that era in terms of consolidation, in terms of the migration to larger markets, all of that sort of stuff, that was ultimately all Morris Podolov's decision. Really, that was his vision for what the NBA was. And I think ultimately a big part of why that came to be in the way that it did, and it worked, I'm not saying this as a negative toward him at all, is that he was not a basketball fan. He was a hockey person through and through. The only basketball player that he ever publicly admitted to liking was Bob Cousy. And so he didn't have the sort of nostalgic undertones toward, well, the Pistons are a team that belongs in Fort Wayne, because the guys like Bobby McDermott and Buddy Johnette and all those sorts of guys that were very important for being the face of basketball in the mid-1940s. And he didn't have that sort of nostalgic attitude toward it at all because he didn't care. And so in a very cutthroat way, in a very dictatorial way over the league, really, once he was able to free himself from needing the New York Knicks to be the team that funds him, and once he was able to be an independent president and commissioner of the league, then he was able to get what he wanted and shape the league in a way that brought us to what it is today. And if anyone else had been the commissioner, I don't know if we would be talking about a National Basketball Association being something that's in existence in anything what we see it as today.
And it seems like you've got another possibly book or two to maybe even go into that sort of dynamic and stuff. I got to think it was also interesting as well that the the Lakers kind of dominated for quite a number of these years, right? Certainly that first merger
It did,
season,
yes.
and then for 3 seasons thereafter, after Rochester had their taste of the champagne in 50-51. I'm wondering if that, and obviously the players and the coaches of that team, essentially, I don't know. I wonder how much that was either helpful or not helpful either, that there was such a, if you will, dominant franchise amongst these teams.
Well, it's interesting because if you look back legacy-wise, it's something that certainly, I think, hurts more than anything because people don't know how to contextualize that Lakers team and the players on it. No one knows what to do with Mikan when, like, it's such a popular exercise these days to rank players, whatever that ultimately means.
Right.
No one knows what to do with that. You often see, like, if it's a 50-person list, they just put him 50 just to have him on the list. That sort of stuff, not taking any, like, serious sort of approach to what Mikan was. And because they were so successful in comparison to their peers that it's easy to not take it seriously until you actually delve into it. That Lakers team, there were a couple of close calls there. It's not like they weren't having 7-game series. They were really taken to the brink by the Knicks there for a while. But they were also bailed out by the fact that the Indianapolis Olympians collapsed. And the Indianapolis Olympians collapsed entirely because of the scandal that happened in college basketball at the time around match fixing and point shaving. Their star players, Alex Groza, was seen by most people as the likely successor to George Mikan as the face of the league. Ralph Beard was probably the second or third best point guard in basketball at that point in time. And I mean, of course, those are point guard's not a technical term at this point in time, that you were still guard, forward, center. But I like to delineate it in a way that's understandable today. But so having Beard and Groza all of a sudden no longer exist in the world of basketball because they've been banned from the NBA. The Olympians were supposed to be the team that would really challenge the Lakers. And then there were a bunch of college guys that should have come into the league at that point in time that didn't as well because they were also banned. Sherman White was probably going to be the first great black player of the NBA, and he was banned for life before he ever made it onto an NBA floor. There was the entire City College of New York team. There was Gene Melchior, who was the number 1 pick in the draft that year. He came out of Bradley. He was the number 1 pick. He was never played a single game because he was banned. There was Bill Spivey, who was the star center for Kentucky coming after Alex Groza. There was never anything that really proved in any reasonable way that he was guilty. He was never found guilty, but he still got banned from the league. And it's like there were a good number of elite prospects that should have been mainstays in basketball from 1951 or 1952 through until the early 60s, who we never got to see play at the top level. And that, I think, there's a notable absence there in terms of what basketball looked like in the 50s in comparison to not just looking forward to the 60s with Chamberlain and Russell and all those sorts of guys, but also looking back to the 40s and the 30s and the 20s, where there's this gap between the tier 1 guys and what was tier 2, but probably should have been like tier 4 or something like that in terms of the talent disparity that shouldn't have been there if it weren't for players getting banned from the league en masse.
So that there's another book right there, right? You could just have you could have a book specifically around that and use that as a I don't know, a scolding or a lesson for perhaps what we're at the cusp of again, now that the betting is legal now. And where, as we record this, we got, I think, 2 or 3 college teams already embroiled in holding back some players for some legalities.
Not to mention there's an NBA player who's now convicted of, I think he's convicted now, Jonte Porter. He's at least charged with betting on games in the NBA, and now a second player who seems to be embroiled in the same situation as a result of that. So it's definitely something that there is relevance to today, that there was this massive scandal back then that really made the sport in a much worse place at that point in time. And of course, multiple smaller scandals since then, the largest of which was 1961 or 62, where Connie Hawkins and those sorts of guys were involved. And so it's certainly cyclical. It's something that really the NBA should have probably thought a lot longer than they did about the ramifications when they went into as much advertising with the gambling that they have, given the history that it itself as the NBA has had with that.
Yeah, you could do a whole book on players that got banned from these leagues, ABA included too.
Yeah. There's
Michael Richardson.
I know that there are books on. I know there are books on the events themselves, but not so much on what the NBA missed out because of it. So I think that's a really interesting idea. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Well, there you go. Well, we get 10%. No, but I mean, like the Connie Hawkins story, right? I mean, Connie Hawkins obviously got some a bit rescued with the ABA and stuff, and you know, there's no question that there's a lot of, but that's what's so interesting about this particular period of time in the beginnings of the NBA, and clearly the NBA certainly had its fallow moments, right? I mean, the competition with the ABA and the fact that the ABA even was created was in some part, not wholly, but in some part, a reaction to just how dour the game had become and boring and troubled, right? It wasn't necessarily as strong as perhaps it could have been. And the ABA kind of came in with literally and figuratively a more colorful approach to the game and giving African-American players a hell of a lot more chances and a wheeling and dealing kind of play and all that kind of stuff. So this to me is just part of, but it's interesting how little, and maybe to your point about why writing this book, I think is really helpful and interesting. I mean, if you consider yourself a fan of the game, not knowing this particular part of the league's even prehistory, right? Which is fair to say, that the dynamism and the dynamics of what the league ultimately became. You know, some of these things are not necessarily new ideas today, just because they're surfacing now. But to not know this stuff, I mean, you know, you wonder, right, if these kids today know this, why is it called the LA Lakers, right? I mean, there's a whole even drama around that. So let me ask you this, a couple of questions to cul-de-sac this, because we could go on forever, which I know you don't have the time to do, but I probably do. But we also want people to buy the book. But let me ask you sort of two to three sort of roundup questions here.
Okay.
And this has been amazing because there's so much more to pick and choosing from. Let's go back to the NBL for a second, because let's talk about the NBA's look back and retroactive continuity, I guess, of this pre-merger history, right? And in particular, we know, most historians know, most people who focus on this stuff know that the BAA in its in the years of its existence prior to going into the NBA, the statistics from the BAA are included in the NBA's history and those teams that were involved, but the NBL's are not.
Yeah.
Now, I guess I can understand maybe going back 12 years and maybe even as a precedent to them, the NBL even had some primordial ooze of it in and of itself. Going back to those 12 years prior probably doesn't make much sense. But the question in there is, there are 5 teams that currently exist in the NBA today that still directly trace or essentially can be credibly traced back to the NBL. Why wouldn't those stats for those teams in their NBL years not be included, or are they? And I'm just missing them.
They're not. There's 2 ways of looking at that. One is from at that point in time, why that decision was made, and then why the decision to add the NBL back into official stats is unlikely today. The reason why it was made when it was is that when the 1950 offseason happened and 4 NBL teams got kicked out of the NBA, or formerly NBL teams got kicked out of the NBA, they started their own league called the NPBL, the National Professional Basketball League, which meant to operate as a rival to the NBA, and did so really well until the season actually started. They managed to get the number 1 pick, a guy named Chuck Scher, who went on to be the starting center for the Hawks teams that battled with Bill Russell in the late 50s, early 60s. He was the number 1 pick by the Boston Celtics. The NBL managed to get him to go to the Waterloo Hawks instead of ever playing a single game for the Boston Celtics. And so they were, and they were bringing in good players. They were very close to bringing in Ed McCauley and Vern Mickelson. This was a really dangerous competitor to the NBA. They ended up not even making it through a full season for various reasons that are included in the book, but are not here. But the NPBL treated themselves, for legitimizing themselves' sake, as an extension of the NBL. And that gave the NBA leadership the excuse to count the BAA, or count themselves as an extension of the BAA, and vice versa. And so that really gave them that opportunity to make that call. And it was a really kind of slow call to make, where in the media, you would all of a sudden see something about like Edelman for Tri-Cities having a certain number of points that is a record, but isn't really a record if you count, or it should be a record in the NBA, but wouldn't be if you count the BAA, and they're not counting it as a record now. And so all of a sudden, these little things start to add up, where all of a sudden they're making it look like the BAA is part of the NBA, despite the fact that in that first season it was made explicit at first that it isn't. Until the All-Star game in 52, they held a recognition of all the players who had been in the league since its founding, who were in the All-Star game. And they chose to include the BAA players who were there since 46, 47, but not the NBL players who had been around that long. Arnie Rison had already been a pro in the NBL a year before that, but because he wasn't in the BAA, he wasn't included in that group of players. And so that was really the first moment where it was very clear and official that the NBA counted the BAA as part of the NBA, but not the NBL as part of the NBA. Today, why they wouldn't do that now, I think it's mostly because it would open up a can of worms that they don't really want to open, specifically regarding race. The NBL did have multiple attempts at integration. The last NBL season, there was a team that was all black players, a black coach, a black owner. And the BAA not only never had that, but then when a vote was held between the two leagues once they merged in 49-50, the vote was pretty overwhelmingly that they did not want to integrate the NBA. And the next year, when it did actually pass, and you got Nat Clifton coming in, and you got Earl Lloyd coming in, and you got Chuck Cooper coming in, it passed by a single vote, and only because the owner of the New York Knicks, inspired by his coach, Joe Lapchick, decided that he was going to use his sort of power over the league and his financial, the financial backing that he had over so much of the league, to make a statement that if the NBA didn't integrate, that the Knicks would pull themselves out of the league entirely. Now, the coach for the Knicks did that on moral reasons. The owner for the Knicks did that because the best center available was Don Barksdale, who was black, and he wanted to be able to have a good center. No one else was available. But that ultimately was just barely enough to get them over the hump of integrating the NBA, of doing. This has been such a long fight of integration in basketball. The first black player to play in a white professional basketball league was 1902. This is 48 years later where it finally happens permanently. And so I think that because the NBL had an all-black team, and before that had a group of 4 players that had been that were black players in the NBL, and before that there was another player, and before that there was another 10 players, I want to say. While the BAA was really a stumbling block in that in the idea of integrating basketball, despite the fact that the BAA was the East Coast and large cities, and you would expect them to be more progressive on that issue. And so I think that, especially when you consider that the largest voice against integration at that point in time was Eddie Gottlieb, who is a Hall of Famer, he was the guy who founded the Warriors, which are now one of the darling teams of the league. The Rookie of the Year award bared his name until a couple years ago. And so there's this aspect of, they really, I think, would not want to go out of their way to have people look through stats and realize, oh, this Pop Gates guy here, he's a Hall of Famer who played professional basketball as a black player for a significant period of time. And he was playing quite a bit before integration happened officially in this white league.
Has there ever been a push towards, and obviously we're not even considering or haven't even talked about African American basketball even preceding the formation of like these pro leagues, like the Ren 5, and all that. The Harlem Globetrotters, of course, were part of that dynamic, and
Yes,
it
yes.
became their own thing too. It's curious to me that the NBA would not want to more wholly embrace that heritage and or help define it, frankly, for those curious, especially given how strong the players union is and dominant by largely black players. You would think that would be a thing that would be of mutual interest, right, to both players and the league's historical narrative.
Well, it's not possible to do that regarding the pre-integration all-black teams ultimately for the significant majority. With regards to like the Harlem Globetrotters and the New York Rens, seeing how good players are, there's not a season, there's not a league to speak of really in terms of being able to retroactively make their stats major league stats in the same way that Major League Baseball has with the Negro Leagues, because they were barnstorming teams. The black teams were never allowed into the major leagues. They were constantly played against some of the best white teams outside of that setting, but they were all exhibition games. And so you can't go back and go through newspapers enough to find, let's say, mid-1930s, there was a guy named Tarzan Cooper who played for the Rens, who was an incredible center, the best center that basketball had seen until Mikan. And you can't go back and see what Tarzan Cooper's stats were. You can get a decent estimate based off of the number of games that we have, but then you have to adjust it for which ones of those games are against the legitimate teams, which ones of those games are against some church league team in South Dakota. And it's just, you can't really contextualize it in that way. And so the only way to really recognize the pre-NBA, pre-integration black players is those who played within the white leagues. And that really complicates the story of integration in a way that the people who are in charge of basketball wouldn't want to do. To see, oh, this guy played from 1902 to 1905, and then outside of the major league system for many years after that. And then there was no one for a long time. And then someone popped up in the 20s, and then there was no one. And then someone popped up in the 30s, and then there was no one. And it's like there was probably 8 or 9 integrations of Major League Basketball before it permanently happened. And so I think there's just kind of, for the players don't care enough about stuff that happened that long ago. And the people who are in charge of the league in terms of narrative crafting certainly don't want to open that can of worms that makes the NBA at its beginning look worse, as opposed to, I mean, it's kind of a simple narrative to have. The BAA came into existence in 1946-47. Then Wat Masaka showed up, and then a few years after that, integration happened with Cooper and Clifton and Earl Lloyd. Like, we don't even mention that there was a 4th black player in that first year, a guy named Hank Dezzoni, who he ended up leaving the league very quickly because of the abuse he faced. That we don't even go into that level of depth, which should be pretty surface level. Like, he's one of the 4 guys. You can't keep track of 4 guys. We have to just stop at the 3. And so I think that there's just a lot of trying to make the NBA's history a lot more sanitized than it is, and basketball as a whole as well.
Yeah, I don't think that's unique to the NBA. Let's be fair.
Yes.
But it seems to me that the issues are much more compelling and complicated in this case versus, say, what MLS is trying to do or not do with regards to the old North American Soccer League, right? Which just happened to be a league that was successful for a while and then failed, and they don't want to bring up the fact that pro soccer failed 40 years ago, right? So I mean,
they're also trying to get rid of
versus some of this stuff, right?
Yeah. And I mean, MLS is also trying to really separate themselves from the U.S. Open Cup, which that's the longest standing competition.
We could go a week on that topic. All right, let me ask you this last question then, and then we'll let you promote and stuff. So, with specifics about sort of going back in time and then the statistics, right? So, let me give you an example and tell me. And I just don't know the answer to this. And maybe, hopefully, you do. I can't imagine you wouldn't. So, take it for example. I'm looking at a team that does have a direct, fairly strong lineage way back to the NBL, and that's the Sacramento Kings.
Yes.
Back in the NBL, right? They joined the NBL in 1945 as the Rochester Royals. And we're not going to talk about Cincinnati and the Kansas City, Omaha thing and all that kind of stuff, right? But they're in Sacramento now, and there's a direct through line to that. So the Royals played in the NBL for what, 2 or 3 seasons, 45 through 48, right? So 6, 7, 3 seasons in the NBL, and then they jumped to the BAA in 48, right?
Yeah. Yes.
So, and then the BAA obviously then merged into the NBA. So I'm pretty certain, right, that the BAA stats of the Rochester Royals are included in the Kings' history, right?
Yes, they are.
What about those 3 years in the NBL prior? In or not?
According to the NBA, no. I'm not sure about according to the team itself.
Okay. So see, to me, that's really interesting. The fact that, number one, such a knowledgeable person as yourself doesn't know that. Okay. Number two, right, is that's to me, okay, and maybe you and I are the only ones who care about this. I doubt it, though. I think that's kind of important because this team, and I'm not even talking about the Rochester Seagrams in the semi-pro that preceded the Royals, right? I'm trying to draw a line at least where, okay, as full professional team, they really kind of started in 1945, right? But according to the NBA, and for anybody who cares about this, they drew another line in the 4th year of the franchise, not the 3 preceding as pros, but that 4th year because they were part of the quote unquote BAA. I think it's odd because you have players and coaches who were part of that team 3 years prior in arguably, and maybe not so arguably, one of the 2 or 2.5 professional leagues that were playing at the time.
And not only that, they were champions.
They actually did merge, right? According to the NBA narrative. So here I am getting apoplectic about something so seemingly small as this, but it's partially why we do this. But I'm just curious: do you think that's kind of either an outrage or a misstep as much as I do? Probably not.
Well, first there, you said they did merge according to the NBA narrative. They did not merge according to the NBA narrative.
Okay.
They did merge officially back at the time. They did merge in actuality. And today is very obvious when you look back at things that are contemporary to that time, that there was a merger that happened. What the NBA suggests is that it was an expansion accompanied by a rebrand, which is a load of nonsense.
Okay. Well, so by the way, just quick parenthetical. We just had this deep conversation about this as how they papered over the ABA relationship, which is definitely a misnomer when it's called a merger. But this is even more subtle.
Yeah, I think so. And maybe just subtle because of the amount of time that has passed since then. But I think that it's certainly easier to overlook. When it comes down to making that differentiation of the Royals, I mean, if you look through an NBA stat book and see the Royals come into existence in 48, 49, when they'd already been in existence for a few years before then, had already been champions in 45, 46, had already had an MVP in 46, 47.
All right, forgot those very important points. You're absolutely correct.
Yeah. It's if you only look at what happened from the BAA onwards, it's very confusing as to how you get there at that point in time. If you just look at these stats and it's like it appears, if you're just looking at that sort of situation for all of the teams that made that movement, and then again the next year those who had come over from the NBL directly to the NBA, it appears at first glance that everyone on these teams is a rookie. And in some of those cases, these guys that appear to be rookies are in their 30s and don't appear to have played basketball since college 8 years ago or something like that. And so it makes it, once you take a second glance at it, it makes it look very, very incomplete. It doesn't make any sense for that from a understanding history sensibility sort of thing. Especially when it does include guys who are Hall of Famers, guys who you can't just not include the NBL years of George Mikan or of Jim Pollard or Bob Davies or any of those sorts of guys, where it's like, that's a huge part of their story.
And I'm sure it's also
it's super frustrating.
A huge part of their Hall of Fame considerations and or inductions too.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely. And we've gone into this point in time, actually, in the last almost 40 years now, in which those considerations don't exist anymore. I think that the last time that an NBL player was inducted into the Hall of Fame based off of what they did in the NBL was Bobby McDermott in '87. I don't think that anyone has since. And that is, they've done the Hall of Fame. I have a lot of complaints about. I won't really get into that. But there's so much ignorance intentionally put forward about pre-NBA stuff in that regard. And so we have gotten to this point now, though, where in the early decades of the Hall of Fame existing, they were taking into account these NBL parts of their careers. But there was a point where people just stopped caring. There was enough of a removal from it that guys who obviously have a case. Leroy Edwards, he was the center for the Oshkosh All-Stars, and he was an MVP. I want to say it was like 4 years in a row or something like that. And he won 2 championships. That was an underperformance. His team should have been a dynasty. They should have won like 5 championships in a row, but they only got 2. But if you look into him at all, it will become very clear immediately. This guy should have been put in the Hall of Fame decades ago, and he's nowhere near it. And it's very odd. So the NBL is just it's been relegated to being forgotten about entirely when it comes to how things are treated in that regard. It's frustrating. A lot of the things around how basketball history in the early days of the NBA and before are treated is just frustrating, and I don't really have much to say beyond that on that issue.
All right, I got two wrap-up questions then. Number one, with regard to today's NBA, do you think there are any teams or any wings of the league or any situational things that have popped up that are or have done it right in terms of calling back some of this stuff that we've talked about, both the pre, the actual, and then the years just after this merger? Are there any outliers, for example, that where some of this history that we've been talking about actually has been recognized or properly memorialized, or that maybe fans might be surprised by, or has it all been whitewashed, if you will, by the league?
It's pretty largely been whitewashed, but I think that there are teams that have done a decent job at attempting to do a little more than nothing, I would say. And the Kings are a good example of that, in that they have decided in recent years to start retiring the jerseys of players who'd played for Rochester again. That's something that I think I don't think that they have with anyone who was only NBL yet. Al Servey should be, Red Holzman should be, but Bob Davies, Bobby Wanzer, those sorts of guys are players who have their jerseys retired now by the Kings. And that is something where there is still a family connection in ownership there. Some of the, I think, minority owners, I'm not sure, of that team, they must be in minority owners, are direct relatives, like great nephew or something like that of Les Harrison, who was the founding owner and coach of the team. And so in that case, there is a reason for them to care about what the Royals were like when they were in Rochester. Regarding whether there's anything that the league does these days that properly recognizes the NBL and before that, I don't think that there really is. The Lakers, of course, have Mikan's jersey number retired now. That honestly is something that I feel is more of a negative than a positive, because he explicitly didn't want his jersey number retired unless his co-stars got their jersey numbers retired. That's why they had that banner up there that had Mikan's name and Slater Martin's name and Jim Pollard's name and Vern Mickelson's name and Clyde LaVellet's name, and I think Coach Kundla as well, and recognized that they won championships. And so then having Mikan get his official jersey retirement there posthumously, with the last input that he had being that he didn't want it retired without the other co-stars retired. That's, I think, an example of trying to do the right thing in that regard, but doing it in a very wrong way.
That's interesting. Yeah, and you would think that the Lakers, with that geographically challenged history, would also be part of it. All right, so here's the second question then is, what more of this story do you think you've got in you to pursue? I got to think that this stirred up some parallel or tangential stories, perhaps. I know you focused on this 1 year of that merger, right? But as I helpfully kind of, for our audience, kind of set the table up for what was going on before it happened, and then the years just after.
Mm-hmm.
It's clearly a moving target, right? Because the 1 year is, while important, right, it belies the fact that there was important stuff that happened, in the years before and the years after that still have significance today, beyond just, some entities forgetting about all this stuff. Any other sort of topics in and around this that you think might be further worth investigation, or perhaps still elude you, given all the stuff that you've done so far?
Well, I am working on early stages, but working on 2 other books right now. And one of them is about the season that directly follows this, 50-51, which that covers significantly what the beginning of this permanent integration of basketball was like, and also what this rivalry between the NBA and the NPBL, this brief rivalry between those leagues, is going to be like at this point in time. And then the other book that I'm working on, it goes the other direction, as you were saying before. And in that one, instead of pinpointing any specific time, I want to highlight players, because one thing that this lack of pre-NBA history has really failed at is in recognizing the great players. Even if you look through the books that do recognize that there is history of basketball before the NBA existed, you'll see something about the original Celtics, generally speaking. You'll see something about the New York Rens, generally speaking, but you don't get to highlight the players. And so what I'm doing with that is small biographies, a couple pages of, I'm not sure yet if it'll be 50 or 100, but I'm aiming for 100 of the most successful professional basketball careers before the NBA existed. And that's been a really interesting thing to start diving into, especially when you get back to before they were making boatloads of money, where you're having these very good players who are at the same time running a donut shop. Or there was a guy who in the early 1910s was a great player who was one of the main oyster catchers off of Long Island. And so the normal lives of these people who happen to be among the best of their era at something that now being among the best of your era means generational wealth, and how they navigated doing what they could to have as successful of a career in basketball as possible, while it being rare that you could do that and only that.
All right, this has been absolutely fascinating stuff. And where else are you going to get the inside scoop on the Firestone Goodyear NBL teams, the PBLA from 1947, the Chicago American Gears dispersal draft to the NBL, and the Indianapolis Olympians, and who even knew about the National Professional Basketball League in 1950 and 51? But that's what we're here for, friends. And Josh, thank you for enlightening us with all of that. You can follow Josh mostly at his contributions at probasketballencyclopedia.com. Also have his email address handy here, but I'm not going to put that out on the airwaves and stuff. And he's got a couple of new books in the works, as you may have heard him hint here. A focus on the next season of this story. Obviously, we're talking about 49 and 50, largely the first NBA season, but his new focus for another book is on the season that came right thereafter, 1950 and 51. Chock full of intrigue there too, and also some looks into the players of the pre-NBA era. And again, you sort of got a hint there that like a lot of early professionals in a lot of other sports, needing to find ways to make ends meet besides the game that they were playing per se, because the real foundations of professional full-time payment had yet to sort of really come into play. All of this preceded by the contents of this great book, and I highly encourage you to get it. It's called The Birth of the Modern NBA, Pro Basketball in the Year of the Merger, 4950, by our guest this week, Josh Elias. And again, you can get a copy of this wherever good books are found, but we'd appreciate it if you go to our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Search up this episode number, he says, 387 with Josh and yours truly, and you'll find a couple of convenient links to said book, either in Kindle or paperback versions, at Amazon, and you'll get it as quickly as humanly possible. We appreciate that, and we thank you for any referral shekels that we get in that process by you doing so. While you're on our website, please check out our merch section. Great stuff there. Our friends at Royal Retros, of course, and oldschoolshirts.com, Yinzelvania. We got a bunch of others that are coming online soon, and you'll hear more about those as well. But check those out, and if you find something that you might like, perhaps a shirt from our friends at TeePublic, all kinds of great stuff there for you to consider, and we appreciate that, of course, as well. You can send us email. We're at hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com, and follow us on the socials, why don't you? We are on the Twitter X thing at Good Seats Still. You'll find us on the Blue Sky at goodseatsstillavailable.com, and just about everywhere else at Good Seats Still Available, including YouTube, by the way, if that's the way you want to ingest this show each week. We publish there. But of course, the best way to get it is to subscribe or follow us on your favorite podcast feed system, platform, whatever you got going there on your device or whatever. And make sure that you add us in there, and maybe a 5-star review on occasion will be helpful. And tell your friends. Let's share the love, shall we? All right, much more love to come to you next week. Different topic. You got to stay tuned to those feeds to find out what that is. And I assure you, you're going to enjoy what we got coming up in the next number of weeks and months ahead. Enjoy the hoops, everybody. We'll see you next week. Take care of yourselves.